This is the image they tried to bury before it ever reached your screen. A sitting president of the United States, red-faced and seething behind the Resolute Desk, slamming his fist on the polished mahogany and screaming at his White House counsel to find a way, any way, to arrest the prime minister of a sovereign allied nation. As of 11:47 a.m. this morning, Tuesday, March 4th, 2026, Donald Trump has publicly demanded the criminal arrest of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, accusing him of economic terrorism, trade sabotage, and conspiring with the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the American economy. For the first time in the history of North American relations, a U.S. president has called for the physical detention of a Canadian head of state. The response from Ottawa was immediate. The response from Canada's Supreme Court was historic. And the response from the global community has left the White House scrambling to contain a diplomatic catastrophe that is spiraling out of control by the hour. We are talking about the collapse of the most important bilateral trade relationship on Earth. We are talking about the potential invocation of NATO Article 5 against the United States by its own ally. We are talking about an economic contagion that is already hemorrhaging across North American supply chains, wiping $340 billion in combined market value off the Toronto and New York stock exchanges before lunch. We are talking about the end of an era. Sources inside the West Wing describe the atmosphere as apocalyptic. The president is reportedly cycling between rage and paranoia, convinced that Carney has orchestrated a global conspiracy to humiliate him. The Secret Service has been placed on elevated alert. The Canadian ambassador has been summoned, then unsummoned, then summoned again. The State Department is in open revolt. Marco Rubio is reportedly refusing to sign off on any extradition paperwork, calling the demand, according to a senior official who spoke on condition of anonymity, constitutionally insane. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how we got here. We are going to explain the legal mechanism Canada just deployed. We are going to reveal what Trump's own Supreme Court loss 2 weeks ago has to do with this. And we are going to answer the question that every geopolitical analyst on the planet is asking right now. Has the American president just triggered the worst diplomatic crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis? Buckle up. The dominoes are falling. To understand why Trump snapped this morning, you have to understand the slow-motion financial humiliation that has been building since February 20th, 2026. That was the day the U.S. Supreme Court handed Trump the most devastating legal defeat of his presidency in the case of Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump. In a brutal 6-3 ruling, the justices declared that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The decision invalidated the sweeping emergency tariffs Trump had imposed on Canada, Mexico, China, and dozens of other nations. The 25% fentanyl tariff on Canadian goods, the 35% escalation from last summer, the so-called Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs, all of it was declared unlawful. Tens of billions of dollars in collected revenue was suddenly in legal limbo. The president called the justices unpatriotic. He called them disloyal to the Constitution. He said he was ashamed of his own appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, saying their decision was an embarrassment to their families. But here is what the mainstream media did not tell you about what happened next. Within hours of the ruling, Trump signed a new executive order imposing a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. He later threatened to raise it to 15%. But there was a critical exemption. Goods compliant with the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement were excluded. On paper, it looked like Canada had won. The IEEPA tariffs were dead. The CUSMA exemption survived. Canadian stocks rallied. The S&P TSX Composite hit a record 33,017, but behind closed doors, according to leaked communications obtained by a major Canadian outlet, Trump was seething. He viewed the Supreme Court loss as a personal betrayal, and he viewed Canada's celebration as a provocation. Sources say Trump became fixated on Mark Carney specifically. The president had never forgiven the Canadian Prime Minister for his speech at Davos in January, where Carney declared a rupture in the rules-based international order and received a standing ovation from the global elite. Trump had responded by telling the Davos audience that Canada lives because of the United States, that Carney should be grateful. He rescinded Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace. He called Carney Governor Carney, a deliberate humiliation. But Carney did not flinch. He went home to Quebec City and told reporters that Canada does not live because of the United States, that Canada thrives because we are Canadian. According to sources inside the National Security Council, Trump circled Carney's quote in a printed briefing document and wrote one word in the margin: traitor. Then came the China deal. In mid-January, Canada reached a preliminary trade agreement with Beijing to lower tariffs on select goods, including allowing 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at reduced rates in exchange for China cutting duties on Canadian canola, lobster, and other agricultural exports. Trump erupted. He threatened a 100% tariff on Canada if Carney made a deal with China. He accused Canada of becoming a drop-off port for Chinese goods. The fact that Carney explicitly stated Canada was not pursuing a free trade agreement with China, that the deal was limited and respected customer obligations, did not matter. In Trump's mind, Carney had sided with Xi Jinping. That was an act of war. The Gordie Howe Bridge incident in early February poured gasoline on the fire. Trump threatened to block the opening of a $4 billion bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, a bridge that Canada paid for entirely. He claimed it was built with virtually no U.S. content and demanded the United States own at least half of the asset. Carney called Trump, explained that Canada funded the construction, that the ownership is shared with Michigan, that American steel, American workers, and American jobs were part of the build. He described the conversation as positive. But sources inside the White House say Trump hung up the phone and told aides Carney talked to me like a schoolteacher. That is reportedly when the arrest talk began. Let us be precise about the legal mechanism Trump invoked this morning. At approximately 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time, the president posted on Truth Social a 412-word statement accusing Mark Carney of engaging in economic terrorism against the United States. The statement alleged that Carney's trade agreements with China, his retaliatory tariffs on American goods, and his provincial alcohol bans on U.S. products constituted deliberate acts of economic sabotage designed to weaken the American industrial base. Trump cited the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the same law his own Supreme Court just told him he cannot use for tariffs, and demanded that the Department of Justice prepare criminal charges and initiate extradition proceedings against the Canadian Prime Minister. He called Carney an enemy of the American people. Here is where it gets constitutionally catastrophic. The DOJ cannot prosecute a foreign head of state for implementing trade policies that are entirely lawful under international law. Sovereign immunity, codified in the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, protects heads of state from criminal prosecution in U.S. courts. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations provides additional layers of protection for foreign officials. There is no criminal statute in the United States that makes it illegal for a foreign leader to impose retaliatory tariffs. There is no extradition treaty provision that covers acts of economic policy. Every legal scholar who has examined Trump's demand in the past 4 hours has reached the same conclusion. It is legally void. It is constitutionally baseless. It is diplomatically suicidal. But here's the catch. Trump does not care about the legal merits. Sources say the demand was designed to create a political spectacle, to force Carney into a defensive posture, to rally the MAGA base around the narrative that Canada is stealing American jobs and conspiring with China. The problem is that this time the spectacle backfired in real time because Canada's Supreme Court was already in session this morning, hearing arguments on an unrelated constitutional matter when the news broke. And what happened next is what left the world speechless. Chief Justice Richard Wagner, reportedly informed of Trump's statement by a clerk during a recess, returned to the bench and issued an extraordinary oral statement from the court. According to multiple Canadian media sources, Wagner stated that the Supreme Court of Canada reaffirms the absolute sovereignty of the Canadian state and the inviolability of its elected officials under both Canadian constitutional law and international law. He stated that any attempt by a foreign power to detain, arrest, or extradite a sitting Canadian Prime Minister would constitute an act of aggression under the United Nations Charter. He then referenced Section 6 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees the mobility rights of Canadian citizens, and Section 11, which protects against extradition except under lawful treaty obligations. No such obligation exists in this case. The statement took less than 3 minutes. It was not a formal ruling. It was not a binding judgment, but it was something far more powerful. It was the highest court in Canada drawing a line in the sand on live television in real time in response to a threat from the President of the United States. The diplomatic community erupted. Within 30 minutes, the British Foreign Secretary issued a statement supporting Canadian sovereignty. France's foreign minister called the situation alarming. Germany's chancellor described Trump's demand as incompatible with the norms of international relations. NATO Secretary General held an emergency call with allied defense ministers. The European Union issued a joint statement affirming the principle that heads of state cannot be subject to foreign criminal prosecution for lawful policy decisions. Now let us talk about the economic hemorrhage, because the markets are not waiting for diplomats to sort this out. By noon Eastern Time, the Canadian dollar had dropped 1.3% against the US dollar, then rebounded sharply as global investors began dumping American assets in protest. The S&P 500 fell 2.1%. Treasury yields spiked as foreign central banks signaled potential divestment from U.S. government debt. The Toronto Stock Exchange, after an initial panic sell-off of $180 billion, stabilized as European and Asian investors began buying Canadian equities as a safe haven play against American instability. Sources at the Bank of Canada say Governor Tiff Macklem is in emergency consultation with counterparts at the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank. The message from Ottawa is clear. Canada's financial system is stable. It is America's credibility that is collapsing. It gets worse. The CUSMA trade review, scheduled to begin this summer, is now in jeopardy. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, who was appointed by Carney specifically because of her deep institutional knowledge and her reputation for grace under pressure, has reportedly paused all preliminary discussions with U.S. trade representatives. The Canadian government is treating the arrest demand as a fundamental breach of diplomatic norms that must be addressed before any trade negotiations can proceed. This means the CUSMA exemption that currently protects $400 billion in annual bilateral trade could expire without renewal. If that happens, every Canadian export to the United States faces the full weight of whatever tariff regime Trump constructs next. We are talking about Ontario auto parts. We are talking about Alberta oil. We are talking about British Columbia lumber. We are talking about Quebec aerospace components. The entire North American supply chain, the most integrated manufacturing ecosystem on Earth, is now held hostage by one man's ego. Here is what nobody is talking about. The Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles were not affected by the Supreme Court ruling 2 weeks ago. Those tariffs, imposed under different legislation, remain in place and continue to inflict real damage. Canadian steel exports to the United States are down roughly $15.5 billion since 2025. Add the diplomatic crisis on top of the existing trade war, and you have the conditions for a complete economic decoupling between the two largest trading partners in the Western Hemisphere. The Bank of Montreal estimates that a full decoupling would reduce Canadian GDP by 3.8% and American GDP by 1.2% over 3 years. That translates to approximately 400,000 Canadian jobs and 1.6 million American jobs. Your 401k is already feeling it. Let us push the scenario to the extreme, because the worst-case projections are now on the table. Scenario 1, Trump instructs U.S. border agents to detain Carney if he enters American territory. This would trigger an immediate invocation of the Vienna Convention, a recall of ambassadors, and potentially a Canadian request for NATO consultation under Article 4, which allows any member state to request consultations when its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. The precedent is Turkey invoking Article 4 during the Syrian civil war, but never in NATO's 77-year history has an ally invoked consultation rights against the United States. The symbolic destruction would be immeasurable. Scenario 2. Trump escalates the rhetoric into action and attempts to use intelligence assets to interfere with Canadian governance. Sources inside the Canadian intelligence community say CSIS, Canada's security agency, has already elevated its threat assessment regarding potential U.S. covert operations. This is not paranoia. Remember, the Globe and Mail reported in January that U.S. officials held covert meetings with far-right leaders of the Alberta secessionist movement and discussed a $500 billion line of credit if Alberta voted to secede. Trump publicly offered support for Alberta's secession. He called it a natural partner for the U.S. If the president is willing to encourage the breakup of a sovereign ally, what else is he willing to do? Scenario 3, the economic war goes nuclear. Canada retaliates by restricting energy exports to the United States. Canada supplies approximately 60% of U.S. crude oil imports, roughly 3.9 million barrels per day. If Carney restricted even 20% of that flow, American gasoline prices would spike by an estimated $1.40 per gallon within 2 weeks. Heating oil in the Northeast would become a crisis commodity. The political fallout for Trump in the 2026 midterms would be catastrophic. This is the leverage Canada holds, and it explains why Trump is so desperate to neutralize Carney personally. Take out the leader, and the resistance collapses. It is the logic of a bully, and it has never worked against a country with $2.1 trillion in GDP, the third largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and a prime minister who used to run the Bank of England. What does Putin see when he watches this? What does Xi Jinping think? They see the leader of the Western alliance threatening to arrest the leader of its closest ally over a trade dispute. They see the projection of American power fracturing at its foundation. Putin sees an opportunity to test NATO's resolve while its two most important North American members are in open conflict. Xi sees confirmation that America's treaty commitments are worthless, that partnership with Washington is conditional on submission. The authoritarian playbook has always been to divide democracies from within. Trump is doing it for them, free of charge. Here is the historical context you need. In 1962, the United States and Canada had a genuine diplomatic crisis over nuclear weapons deployment. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker refused to accept American nuclear warheads on Canadian soil during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy was furious. But even at the height of Cold War tensions, with Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida, the American president never, not once, called for the arrest of the Canadian Prime Minister. In 1971, Richard Nixon imposed a 10% import surcharge on all foreign goods, including Canadian products, without warning. Pierre Trudeau called it a shock, but Nixon never accused Trudeau of treason. He never demanded his detention. What Trump did this morning has no precedent in the 158-year history of Canadian-American relations. The constitutional implications are staggering. The emoluments clause, the treaty power, the foreign affairs doctrine, all of them are being stress-tested simultaneously. If a president can unilaterally demand the arrest of a foreign head of state for implementing lawful trade policies, then the entire framework of international diplomacy collapses. Every nation that has a trade disagreement with America is now a potential target. The EU, Japan, South Korea, India, every one of them is watching this and recalculating their relationship with Washington. The founders understood that concentrated power in the executive branch, unchecked by law and norms, would lead to tyranny. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 75 that the power of treaties requires the joint possession of the legislature and executive precisely because a man raised from the station of a private citizen to the rank of chief magistrate might sometimes be under temptations to sacrifice his duty to his interest. Hamilton was describing this exact moment. This is not celebrity gossip. This is not partisan theater. This is the stress test of the North American alliance system, the same system that won the Cold War, that defended democracy for 80 years, that built the most prosperous continent in human history. The question is no longer whether Trump will back down. The question is whether the institutions designed to restrain him, the courts, the Congress, the military chain of command, the career diplomatic corps, are strong enough to prevent a single ego from demolishing a relationship that 380 million people depend on for their economic survival. Mark Carney is currently in Australia, where earlier today he told reporters that dealing with Trump is not easy. He said, "You cannot speak about Trump off the cuff. You have to choose your words carefully." But he also said Trump was duly elected, that he listens to ideas, that there are productive conversations to be had. Even after being threatened with arrest, the Canadian Prime Minister is leaving the door open. That is not weakness. That is the discipline of a man who ran the Bank of England through the Brexit crisis, who managed the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial collapse, who understands that markets and alliances are built on stability, not spectacle. Watch the feeds tonight. Watch for the NATO response. Watch for the congressional reaction, because a bipartisan group of senators, including several Republicans, has already drafted a resolution condemning any attempt to arrest a foreign leader for trade policies. Watch the Canadian dollar. Watch the bond markets. Watch whether Trump doubles down on Truth Social or whether his advisors manage to pull him back from the edge. And watch the Kuzma timeline, because if those talks collapse, the $2.7 billion in daily cross-border trade between the United States and Canada becomes the single largest economic casualty of the Trump presidency. But most importantly, watch Carney, because the man Trump just threatened to throw in prison is the same man who stood in Davos and told the world that if middle powers are not at the table, they are on the menu. Canada just sat down at the table and the Supreme Court pulled up their chair. The sheriff tried to come for the prime minister. The court said no, and the world is still processing what that means. The American century was built on alliances. What we are watching is what happens when the architect takes a sledgehammer to the foundation and wonders why the roof is caving in. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The history books are being written in real time, and this chapter has just begun.